October 1943. A moonless night in occupied France, fog rolling through the forests near WWII. And so the agent crouches in underbrush 30 yards from a German checkpoint. 2 sentries patrol the forest road, rifles slung, cigarettes glowing in the darkness. The agent raises a weapon. No gunpowder, no muzzle flash, no suppressor hiss, just the whisper of rubber bands releasing tension. The first sentry drops, silently. A 10-inch aluminum bolt protruding from his chest, his companion turning too late to understand what killed him. The second sentry falls before he can scream. The weapon that killed them looked like a child's toy crossed with medieval siege equipment. It had no gunpowder, no bullets, no moving parts beyond rubber bands and wire. It was, by conventional military standards, the most absurd weapon ever issued to Allied special forces. It was also the most silent killing tool of the entire war. This was the Allied combat crossbow, code named Little Joe and Big Joe. And it represented warfare's strangest contradiction, a weapon so effective at killing silently that history cannot prove it ever killed anyone at all. The story begins not with a weapon, but with an impossible problem that conventional firearms could not solve. By 1942, Allied intelligence agencies faced a tactical nightmare that would require them to reach 6 centuries backward for inspiration. The Germans controlled Europe with a network of sentries, guard dogs, and checkpoints that made infiltration nearly suicidal. Suppressed pistols existed, but even the quietest produced 73 decibels, loud enough to alert nearby guards. What was needed was something quieter than a whisper, something that left no muzzle flash, something that could kill at 30 yards without any sound whatsoever. The answer, bizarrely, was a weapon last used in earnest during the 100 Years' War. British and American weapons designers independently arrived at the same medieval solution, resurrect the crossbow, but engineer it with modern materials and modern lethality. The result would be weapons so unusual that decades later, historians still debate whether they were brilliant innovations or desperate follies. Between 1942 and 1945, Allied research facilities produced at least 4 distinct crossbow designs. Rubber bands replaced traditional bow limbs. Aluminum bolts replaced wooden arrows. Collapsible frames allowed concealment in briefcases and coats. The specifications were remarkable: 170 feet per second muzzle velocity, 72 decibels on firing, quieter than normal conversation, and the ability to penetrate a human torso at distances up to 30 yards. Some models folded to just 11 inches. Others featured rifle stocks and tactical sights. Production numbers remain classified even today, but estimates suggest between 50 and 200 units were manufactured and distributed to OSS and SOE operatives across occupied Europe and the Pacific Theater, and then they vanished from history. No confirmed kill reports, no named operations, no combat after action reports mentioning crossbow eliminations of sentries or guard dogs. The weapons were designed for absolute silence, distributed to elite operatives, and then disappeared into a historical void that raises a disturbing question. Did they fail completely, or did they work so perfectly that successful missions left no evidence behind? The problem facing British SOE and American OSS in 1942 was a paradox wrapped in blood and failure. Churchill had ordered his new intelligence agency to set Europe ablaze through sabotage, assassination, and guerrilla warfare behind enemy lines. President Roosevelt's OSS faced similar mandates across occupied territories in Europe and the Pacific. Both organizations needed operatives who could move through enemy territory, eliminate targets, and vanish without trace. But conventional weapons made silent killing nearly impossible. By mid-1942, the strategic situation demanded a capability that did not exist. Germany controlled Europe from the Atlantic to the Volga. Japan held the Pacific from Burma to the Gilbert Islands. Every mile of occupied territory crawled with sentries, checkpoints, and patrols. Resistance networks needed weapons. Saboteurs needed access. Assassins needed silence. The challenge was not killing. It was killing without anyone knowing death had arrived. Churchill understood this intimately. In July 1940, he had created the Special Operations Executive with explicit instructions conduct espionage, sabotage, and reconnaissance in occupied Europe by any means necessary. SOE's mandate included ungentlemanly warfare, a phrase that captured the desperation of Britain's position. Conventional military force had failed. Dunkirk had proven that. If Britain was to survive, It needed agents who could strike from shadows and disappear into fog. The Americans faced identical requirements when the Office of Strategic Services was established in June 1942. OS Director William Wild Bill Donovan envisioned operatives who could infiltrate deep behind Japanese and German lines, gather intelligence, organize resistance movements, and eliminate high-value targets, all without revealing their presence. Both organizations confronted the same lethal gap. Existing weapons were too loud. When an OSS agent needed to eliminate a sentry guarding a railway bridge in occupied France, the options were grim. Method 1 required a knife. This meant closing to arm's length with a trained German soldier, engaging in a struggle that might last 10 seconds, and hoping the target died before screaming. Many agents died trying. Sentries often worked in pairs. A knife attack on one guaranteed the second would raise an alarm. Method 2 involved a suppressed pistol. The British had recently developed the Welrod, a remarkable weapon that reduced gunfire to approximately 73 decibels. This was quieter than most firearms, but still loud enough to be heard 50 yards away on a quiet night. If the target stood near other guards, a Welrod shot risked discovery. If the agent missed, the target would scream before dying. Method 3 was strangulation wire, or bare hands. This required getting within grappling distance, maintaining control during the victim's death throes, and avoiding any outcry. Against alert sentries, this approach bordered on suicidal. In August 1942, an SOE operation in Norway illustrated the cost of inadequate silent weapons. 2 agents approached a German communications facility, guarded by a single sentry and his dog. The agents carried knives and Welrod pistols. The dog detected them first. One agent shot the dog with his Welrod. The sound, barely louder than a cough, nevertheless alerted the sentry, who fired his rifle before being killed. The rifle shot brought a squad of German soldiers. Both SOE agents died in the firefight that followed. The mission failed because a weapon designed to be silent was still too loud. What was needed was something fundamentally different. A weapon that produced no explosion, no mechanical action sound, and no muzzle signature that could betray an agent's position. The specifications were daunting. First, absolute silence. The weapon needed to produce less than 60 decibels, quieter than normal conversation, quiet enough that a guard standing 20 feet away would hear nothing unusual. Second, lethality at range. Knife attacks required suicidal proximity. The new weapon needed to kill reliably at 20 to 30 yards, allowing the agent to engage from concealment and withdraw before discovery. Third, concealability. Agents operated in civilian clothes, often traveling through checkpoints with false papers. Any weapon had to be small enough to hide in a coat, briefcase, or bag without arousing suspicion during searches. Fourth, simplicity. The weapon would be used by agents under extreme stress, often in darkness, frequently by personnel with limited weapons training. Complex mechanisms would fail. Reliability demanded simplicity. Fifth, ammunition that killed instantly. A wounded target who screamed or fired his weapon would compromise the entire mission. Every shot needed to be immediately incapacitating. The vulnerability was profound. Germany's occupation infrastructure depended on thousands of isolated sentries, checkpoint guards, and facility watchmen. A single German soldier standing guard over a bridge, a fuel depot, or a communications station represented the entire Wehrmacht's authority in that moment. Kill that sentry silently and saboteurs gained access. Destroy the bridge or depot, and German logistics suffered. Across occupied Europe, hundreds of critical targets stood guarded by 1 or 2 men. Railway junctions, power stations, ammunition dumps, communications towers, radar installations. Each represented a potential mission, if agents could eliminate guards without alerting reinforcements. The same pattern repeated across the Pacific. Japanese sentries guarded airfields, supply dumps, and coastal installations on hundreds of islands. American OS operatives working with Filipino guerrillas needed to eliminate these guards to conduct reconnaissance and sabotage operations. In both theaters, the bottleneck was identical. Existing silent weapons were not silent enough. By October 1942, both SOE and OSS had independently reached the same conclusion. Incremental improvements to suppressed firearms would not solve the problem. Gunpowder, by its nature, produced noise and flash. Even the finest suppressor technology could not eliminate the fundamental signature of chemical propellant combustion. The solution would require abandoning gunpowder entirely. What both organizations needed was a weapon using a propulsion method so fundamentally different that it produced no explosion, no gas expansion, and no acoustic signature beyond the whisper of a projectile cutting through air. The British and Americans needed to reinvent assassination technology from first principles. They needed something medieval. The solution came from two facilities on opposite sides of the Atlantic, working independently toward the same medieval answer. Station Exton at Aston House near Stevenage in Hertfordshire served as the British SOE's primary research and development centre. The estate, a Georgian country house opposite the village church, became Britain's most secret weapons laboratory in 1940. Under the direction of Major John Dolphin and his successor Colonel Frank Newitt, Station Exton developed everything from explosive rats to invisible inks. During the war, Aston House produced over 3 million devices, including time-delayed explosives, booby traps, and silent killing tools. The facility employed chemists, engineers, and designers whose names remain largely classified, but the British never fully developed operational crossbows. That innovation came from America. In October 1942, the U.S. Office of Strategic Services submitted a request to the National Defense Research Committee that would change silent warfare forever. The OSS specification demanded a weapon with 1,000 feet per second muzzle velocity, 30-second reload time, and absolute silence. The NDRC's engineers analyzed gunpowder-based solutions and concluded they were impossible. Someone suggested looking backward instead of forward. The lead designers were engineers whose names appear only fragmentarily in declassified documents. They approached the problem not as firearms experts, but as physicists studying energy storage and release mechanisms. The crossbow, dormant since the 16th century, suddenly looked revolutionary. The fundamental challenge broke into three distinct problems. The energy source had to store sufficient power to drive a projectile through a human torso at 30 yards without using explosives or compressed gas. The release mechanism needed to be silent, reliable, and operable by agents wearing gloves in darkness. The projectile had to be lethal, accurate, and light enough for the weapon to remain portable. To achieve lethality without gunpowder, all three elements had to work in perfect harmony. PRBLEM-ONE, energy storage without explosion. Traditional crossbows used steel or wood limbs that bent under tension and snapped forward when released. This design was loud. The crack of limbs straightening produced 80 to 90 decibels. Steel limbs were also bulky and prone to breaking under stress. The solution abandoned solid limbs entirely. American engineers replaced traditional bow construction with arrays of latex rubber bands stretched between a triangular aluminum frame. The Little Joe pistol crossbow used approximately 50 rubber bands arranged in parallel. The larger WWII rifle variant used even more, creating an elastic energy storage system that was silent, lightweight, and collapsible. The physics were elegant. Rubber bands under tension stored potential energy without rigid structures. When released, they accelerated the projectile smoothly and silently. No crack, no snap, just the soft rush of rubber contracting. Testing revealed this system produced only 72 decibels on firing, quieter than a suppressed pistol and barely louder than a whisper. The design also solved portability. When tension was released, the rubber bands went slack and the entire frame could fold to a fraction of its firing size. PRBLEM-TWO, the silence of mechanical action. Even silent propulsion meant nothing if the release mechanism clicked, snapped, or rattled when operated. Traditional crossbow triggers used metal catches that produced distinctive mechanical sounds. The solution minimized moving parts and used sound-dampening materials. The Little Joe employed a simple two-finger release mechanism. A graphite-coated linen section in the center of the rubber band array made contact with the projectile. When the trigger released the retention fingers, the rubber contracted smoothly against the dampened contact point, eliminating metal-on-metal contact. The effect was extraordinary. A standard crossbow trigger produced approximately 65 decibels. The Little Joe's release mechanism generated less than 50 decibels, quieter than rustling leaves. PRBM trap projectile designed for silent lethality. Arrows were too light and too slow. Bullets required gunpowder. What was needed was something between the two. A projectile heavy enough to retain energy at range, but aerodynamic enough to fly accurately from a low-velocity weapon. The solution custom engineered aluminum darts with broad cutting heads. The projectiles measured 10 inches long and weighed 8 ounces, substantially heavier than arrows but lighter than bullets. The shaft was machined from aluminum to save weight while maintaining rigidity. The head featured a broad steel cutting point designed to create massive wound channels. Metal flighting at the rear provided stable flight. Testing at ranges up to 30 yards demonstrated the darts could penetrate completely through a uniformed human torso. At point-blank range, they punched through 276 pages of the Washington, D.C. telephone directory. The lethality came not from velocity but from the combination of weight, sharp cutting surfaces, and stable flight that put every dart exactly where aimed. Production methods evolved through multiple iterations between late 1942 and early 1945. The Little Joe penetrometer emerged first in February 1943. This pistol-sized weapon measured 13 inches long and 8 inches high, weighing just 25 pounds. It featured a hinged upper arm that pivoted backward until the rubber band array engaged with the release mechanism. Adjustable sights allowed precise aiming. With efficient cocking, the weapon could fire 4 rounds per minute. The Big Joe 5 followed as a shoulder-fired variant. This weapon stretched to approximately 28 inches, with stock extended, and featured greater rubber band arrays for increased power. Effective range extended to 200 yards against stationary targets. The William Tell crossbow represented the final refinement, a hybrid design combining crossbow accuracy with slingshot simplicity, reportedly the quietest weapon in the entire OSS arsenal. Production began in early 1943 at facilities whose exact locations remain partially classified. The exact numbers remain disputed even today, but estimates suggest between 50 and 200 crossbow units were manufactured across all variants. Some sources claim as few as 11 Little Joe Pedal II models were produced before refinement into the William Tell design. The Big Joe 5 may have seen slightly higher production numbers, though no official records confirm this. The uncertainty exists not from poor record keeping but from deliberate secrecy. OSS weapons development records were compartmentalized, with different facilities handling different components. After the war, many documents were destroyed or remain classified. What survives are fragments, test reports, specification sheets, and tantalizing references in operational planning documents that mention crossbow distribution without providing details. What is known to? The weapons were light enough for airborne insertion and compact enough for covert transport. Distribution relied on the OSS and SOE networks that supplied resistance movements across occupied Europe and the Pacific. RAF Special Duties squadrons flew Halifax, Stirling, and Lysander aircraft on nighttime supply drops to resistance groups in France, Belgium, Norway, Denmark, and the Netherlands. By war's end, these squadrons had completed thousands of sorties, delivering tons of weapons, explosives, and equipment. Whether crossbows numbered among those deliveries remains unclear. No manifests explicitly list crossbow shipments, though many manifests remain classified or were never created for security reasons. Here is where the story becomes complicated. Despite production numbers suggesting dozens to hundreds of weapons distributed across 2 theaters of war, documented records of specific crossbow attacks remain remarkably sparse. No named operations appear in declassified sources. No confirmed sentry kills are attributed to crossbows in official after-action reports. No resistance group memoirs mention receiving or using the weapons. This absence requires explanation, and there are 3 possibilities. First, the weapons may have been impractical. Despite ingenious engineering, crossbows required cocking strength that agents under stress found difficult to manage. Rubber bands degraded in humid environments. Ammunition was bulky and difficult to replace. Suppressed pistols, though louder, offered faster reloading and more ammunition capacity. The crossbow may have been a brilliant solution to a problem better solved by conventional weapons. Second, successful attacks may be historically invisible. The weapon was designed to leave no acoustic signature, no muzzle flash, and no obvious evidence of foul play. A German sentry found dead with an aluminum bolt through his chest might initially appear to have been shot with a conventional weapon. If the agent retrieved the bolt, standard operational procedure, German investigators would find only a puncture wound. In darkness, under combat conditions, precise cause of death determinations were rare. If crossbows worked as intended, successful attacks would generate no distinctive records. Third, distribution may have been extremely limited. If only a handful of weapons reached operational units, and if those units used them sparingly for highest value targets, the statistical likelihood of documented evidence appearing in surviving records becomes vanishingly small. The truth likely combines all three factors. What can be confirmed is that the concept reached serious operational consideration. OS planning documents reference crossbows for Pacific theater operations against Japanese sentries. SOE training materials from 1943 mention silent projectile weapons. Several crossbow variants reside in military museums today, proving they existed beyond prototype stage. One fragmentary account describes OS operatives in Burma using silent weapons, possibly crossbows, against Japanese guards during reconnaissance missions in 1944. The account provides no specifics, no dates, no confirmed kills. Another reference suggests SOE agents received training on medieval silent weapons at facilities in Scotland, though what exactly they trained with remains unspecified. If you're finding this deep dive into silent warfare interesting, a quick subscribe helps more than you know. It helps the channel and means you won't miss the next one. The psychological impact on Axis forces, if crossbows were used, would have been substantial though unmeasurable. German and Japanese soldiers already faced partisan attacks, sabotage, and assassination across occupied territories. The introduction of a weapon that killed without sound would have intensified the paranoia that every shadow concealed death. German counterintelligence reports from 1943-1944 occasionally reference concerns about Allied silent weapons, though whether these referred to crossbows, suppressed pistols, or knives remains unclear. In evaluating the crossbow's battlefield performance, comparison to enemy and Allied equivalent weapons provides context. German silent weapons during this period were primarily suppressed firearms. The Walther PPK with suppressor could achieve approximately 110 decibels, significantly louder than Allied suppressed weapons and far louder than crossbows. German forces never developed crossbow technology for covert operations, relying instead on conventional suppressed pistols and knives for sentry elimination. The Americans produced multiple variants as described: Little Joe, Big Joe, and William Tell, each achieving 72 decibels or quieter with effective ranges to 30 yards. This represented the quietest projectile weapon technology of the war. British forces fielded the Welrod pistol, achieving 73 decibels with 32 ACP ammunition. The Welrod saw extensive confirmed operational use across multiple theaters. Its reliability and faster reload time made it more practical than crossbows for most missions, though it remained louder than the OSS crossbow designs. In the silent warfare category of World War II weapons development, the crossbow occupied a unique position. It was quieter than any firearm, more powerful than knives, and more complex than either. Whether that combination proved advantageous in actual combat remains history's unanswered question. October 1943, a moonless night in occupied France. Fog rolling through forests where sentries may or may not have fallen to weapons history cannot confirm. British and American engineers created a weapon so silent that its successes remain invisible 7 decades later, so effective at leaving no evidence that confirming its battlefield use becomes impossible. So specialized that even producing it required secrecy that outlasted the war itself. Between 50 and 200 crossbows manufactured. Distribution to resistance networks across occupied Europe and the Pacific documented in fragmentary records. Unknown number of missions conducted with weapons designed to kill without ever proving they had killed. The Allied combat crossbow represents silent warfare at its most paradoxical. A weapon measured not in confirmed kills, but in the absence of evidence. Not in enemy casualties, but in missions completed without alarm. Not in tactical victories, but in strategic uncertainty that persists into the present. British and American engineers solved a problem most military planners had not identified. They recognized that gunpowder's fundamental chemistry made true silence impossible. They turned 6 centuries backward for inspiration and discovered that medieval technology, rebuilt with modern materials and modern understanding, could outperform contemporary firearms in one critical dimension. And they did it with rubber bands, aluminum tubing, and engineering brilliance that prioritized silence over every other consideration. The concept's influence extended beyond 1945. Cold War intelligence agencies studied OSS crossbow designs for covert operations. Modern silent weapons, from pneumatic dart guns to advanced suppressor technology, trace design philosophies pioneered at facilities developing these weapons. The principle that perfect silence requires abandoning conventional propulsion remains valid. That was Allied ingenuity during total war. That was OSS and SOE weapons development. And that was how a medieval weapon, reborn through modern engineering, became the war's most silent killer, whether it killed 1 sentry, 100, or exists only as the threat that terrified guards across 2 continents who never knew what might whisper toward them from darkness.